Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And tonight we have an interview I recorded a wee bit earlier today with Delyth Jewell, a member of the Welsh Senate for Plaid Cymru. But before we get to that, we have all the news headlines for you. We start, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 612,990 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 591,942 were confirmed negative, 21,048 were positive. There were 159 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, but we did have a day with no new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases. Not everyone with the virus will necessarily display symptoms, and not all of those will necessarily get themselves tested. As always, we do urge you, if you are showing symptoms of any kind, please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who did test positive, there were 258 people in hospital last night, 4 of whom were in intensive care. It is worth noting that not all of those 258 are still suffering with COVID-19. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,496. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. And the latest UK daily figures available show that 41,537 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 10 since yesterday. This number does refer to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. Nearly £1.6 billion to directly support up to 5,000 jobs and tackle fuel poverty is at the heart of plans to drive Scotland's green recovery and end our contribution to climate change. As part of an enhanced Green New Deal, the investment will transform heat and energy efficiency of buildings and rapidly accelerate the decarbonisation of an area which makes up a quarter of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. An additional £500 million is being invested in Scotland's natural economy, including £150 million to help deliver a 50% increase in woodland creation by 2024 and an extra £150 million for flood risk management, vital to increasing climate change resilience. Thousands of British food businesses could be left without the correct labelling required to continue selling to the European Union and Northern Ireland, after the UK government missed an industry deadline to advise them on what new rules they will have to follow. UK trade associations repeatedly warned Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government that the end of August was the absolute deadline for issuing guidance that will allow them to produce new labels in time for January the 1st. However, with just 4 months to go, they are still waiting for clarity from the UK government on the labelling rules they will have to follow in 2021. Russia's Sputnik V COVID-19 vaccine produced an antibody response in all participants in early stage trials, according to results published in the Lancet Medical Journal today. The results of the 2 trials, conducted in June and July of this year and involving 76 participants, showed 100% of participants developing antibodies to the new coronavirus and no serious side effects, the Lancet has said. Russia licensed the 2-shot jab for domestic use in August, the first country to do so, and before any data had been published or a large-scale trial had begun. In the US, public health officials and drug manufacturer Pfizer have said their vaccine could be ready for use as soon as October, following accelerated safety trials there. But the World Health Organization has warned that the world should not expect widespread vaccinations before mid-2021, as safety trials must be rigorous. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has called on the United Nations to condemn the violent crackdown by President Alexander Lukashenko on protesters who allege that he rigged his re-election last month. Speaking to an informal virtual session of the UN Security Council, Tikhanovskaya also urged the United Nations to send an international monitoring mission to Belarus and said the UN Human Rights Commission should hold a special session on the human rights situation in the country. US President Donald Trump has denied a report in The Atlantic that he spoke disparagingly about American World War I soldiers buried in France, and refused to visit an American cemetery there because he thought it unimportant. The report claimed that Trump had referred to the Marines buried near Paris as losers and declined to visit during his 2018 trip because he didn't want the rain to mess up his hair. Trump has told journalists today that the report was false. Trump had already earned criticism from veterans organizations during his 2015 campaign after he criticized Senator John McCain, a former prisoner of war in Vietnam, saying, "He was a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured." Travellers from Portugal and French Polynesia will be required to self-isolate at home or another specified address for 14 days on arrival in Scotland from 4 a.m. on Saturday morning. This is due to a significant rise in cases of coronavirus in these places, and in Portugal's case, the level of test positivity, which means that the risk of importation into Scotland by people who have visited is considered too high to ignore. And finally, patients with chronic eye conditions will be now able to be assessed by community optometrists as part of a new plan supported by £3 million in funding. Due to changes in hospital services because of COVID-19, including health, safety and physical distancing measures, there has been limited capacity to see all patients with chronic and sight-threatening conditions. Under the new plan, the skills of community optometrists will be utilised to support hospital eye services, ensuring more patients can be seen for their appointments. So that's all the news we have for today, and now we do go to that interview that I recorded with Delyth Jewell earlier this afternoon. And I'm joined now by Delyth Jewell, a member of the Welsh Senate and Shadow Minister for Transforming Public Services and the Future. Delyth, how are you today?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm not bad. So how are things generally in Wales just now with the pandemic and everything? How are you getting on personally, and how do you feel the country's coping?
Well, in terms of how things are going at the moment, up until very recently, things were looking a lot better in the region that I represent. So I'm in the southeast of Wales, so the bottom southeast corner of the country. In the past couple of days, we've seen an increase in cases very near to me because people are not following social distancing guidelines. So hope that can change soon. But yeah, in terms of how I am, gosh, it's just such a strange period, isn't it? I mean, I think that we are going to be case studies for people in the future about how the kind of way how we as a society coped with these big changes. I mean, I'm just very grateful about the fact that the past few months have been manageable for me, that it hasn't meant a huge, tremendous disruption to my life, but I represent so many people who haven't been as lucky. So I feel very lucky and guilty about that, and angry on their behalf. But I mean, yeah, Wales at the moment, we're in an interesting place, I think, because I'm sure we'll be talking about this as we go on in the conversation. But people in Wales have become a lot more aware the past few months about devolution. We don't have the same media in Wales that's independent as you do in Scotland, but people are more aware of the fact that we have a government in Wales that makes decisions based on health, education policy and so on. And people are grateful for that. There are lots of things I've been frustrated with the Welsh Government about, of course, but I'm glad that that people's awareness of devolution is developing. So I mean, I guess that's something that you wouldn't see as much in Scotland because people are much more informed about Scottish politics because of the fact that the media is so much stronger with you. But yeah, some interesting dynamics which are changing at the moment, and I think that will have an effect certainly on the election next year. Too early to say what that effect is going to be, but I hope very much that Plaid Cymru will do well and will be in government next year, because yeah, again, as we're going to be talking about, there are lots of things that need to change.
Now, you mentioned the media there. This was something that we talked to you about way back, much nearer the beginning of the pandemic, and you commented how difficult it might be for a distinct Welsh policy to get through to people because you are lacking in independent sort of Welsh only media. Is that still a problem? I mean, I noticed today, for example, the UK government complaining about confusion about quarantine rules because Wales had changed some regulations. How big a problem is that for Wales just now?
So I think that, as I say, over the months of the lockdown, I think that that has changed quite a bit. We, at the beginning of the lockdown, we were still seeing UK ministers like the Education Secretary, whose remit is England only, still being referred to in the media as the either just the Education Secretary or the UK Education Secretary. I mean, that had to change because actually a number of people, including the Welsh Government's official Twitter account, I will give them that they're due, that they did actually start tweeting broadcast media outlets and newspaper outlets saying this is a devolved issue. So I think that that was something that did have to change. And one of the interesting dynamics that's come about is that because that distinction had to be made clear, I think that Boris Johnson, in many ways, has been the Prime Minister of England during the pandemic period. Not in every way, but in lots of ways. And that has had to be made clear in the media as well. It always hasn't been made perfectly clear, but the distinction has had to be made. So I think that in terms of how people in Wales feel about things now, I've seen a lot of people being very grateful about the fact that Wales was able to, when we were at the height of the pandemic, that Wales was able to kind of take care of our citizens more. Obviously, you'll have mixed feelings about that. It wasn't universally welcomed, but when the UK government for England decided to move away from the stay-at-home messaging, and they just moved to this stay alert, whatever that exactly meant, Wales and Scotland kept with the stay-at-home messaging for far longer. And as a result of that, people were discouraged from travelling into Wales to go to the beach or anything like that, or to go on holiday. And inevitably, you'll get some outlets in the media who will try and say that that is an anti-English thing, which it absolutely wasn't, of course. I think lots of Welsh citizens were grateful that that distinction was able to be made. I wish that that was something that the Welsh Government had been completely consistent on, because when they were taking that stance, it was something that I completely supported. But I'm afraid that there have been things more recently, like what happened with the A-level results fiasco, where they have wanted to stick to their guns and more likely stick to what England was doing rather than go it alone. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag.
Mm. Now, obviously, the pandemic is happening against the existing backdrop of Brexit. This has been something that's been kind of hanging over all of politics in Britain for the last few years. And we spoke to Michael Russell the other day, and he was saying how basically the communications between the British government and the Scottish government had pretty much broken down, but that he was still communicating quite a lot with the Welsh government and the executive in Northern Ireland. What's been your perception of how those negotiations have gone recently? Do you get the feeling that Wales has a seat at the table?
So not to the extent that it should, if this union actually functioned in the way that unionists want to believe it does. So the last time I believe that Boris Johnson picked up the phone to Mark Drakeford was the 28th of May. Unless that has changed during the recess period, which I haven't heard that it has, certainly at the end of July, that was the case. That was last time that Boris Johnson had a direct conversation with the First Minister of Wales. I think that says everything you need to know about the regard that Westminster holds the Welsh Government in with these issues. And yeah, with Brexit, obviously it is an ongoing frustration that the timing of this potential no deal that is still hanging over everyone's heads could well come at a time when there could be a second wave of coronavirus. The UK government, I think that we are almost uniquely in uniquely bad luck in terms of the caliber of the ministers in the UK cabinet at the moment. I mean, when you hear some of them talking about different things, most of your viewers will have seen this clip that's gone viral on Twitter of Matt Hancock defending the fact that they are using Tony Abbott to help with trade. And in this ridiculous exchange with Kay Burley from Sky News, Kay Burley was making the point to him that Tony Abbott, in her words, as she was saying, so he is a homophobe and he's a homophobe and a bigot, I think, but I may be misquoting her there. But certainly she is making these points about these really horrible things that he's reported to have said. And Matt Hancock at one point said, yes, but he also knows a lot about trade, as though these things cancel each other out. I mean, the extent to which the UK government is willing to think in what they're willing to put up with in order to get trade deals that will put us in a disadvantageous position compared with where we are now. It's appalling. It should be shocking, and things like that still are shocking. But I think we've all become a little bit numbed to it because it's been going on for so long. But I know people's anger hasn't gone away, and the fact that the UK government seems willing to put the health of the citizens living in these islands at risk in order to see good on the rhetoric that they promised before even knowing how it was going to work. I mean, I just think, like I say, that we are in uniquely poor luck in terms of who is leading the UK government at the moment. And yeah, I'm sure that Michael Russell will be very dismayed at how the UK government is refusing to cooperate with the devolved administrations. Their plans for a UK single market seem to be, or this UK internal market, are just all focused on what would suit their own goals and forcing devolved administrations to conform with what they want to do. I really worry about what's going to happen to devolution because, again, I'm sure we'll come on to it. I think that it's very clear for Scotland and for Wales that there are two possible futures. One is independence and the other is being subsumed back into England.
Yeah, this internal market thing, that was actually my next question. So very nice segue. Thank you. The response here, obviously, the Scottish government has come out very strongly against it. We've also heard lots of trade bodies up here coming out against it. Has it been a similar reaction in Wales? And what's been the response of the Welsh government? What's their take on this?
So I think the Welsh government is opposed to it. I think that they've been more muted than the Scottish government because they have, I think that they want to believe always that they will be able to make the union work. And I know that they seem to be always dismayed with the fact that the reality of how the union actually treats us lets them down every single time, but they still every time want to believe that it can be made to work. And so I think that I get the impression, at least, that the Welsh government has by now probably reached a similar position to where the Scottish government is. It's taken them longer to lose all hope that the UK government will listen to us. But I mean, with some of the proposals going for, that are actually being put forward by the UK government, there would be no independent kind of dispute resolution. The UK government would be judge and jury of matters where they're one of the subjects that are affected by it. So there would be no one who would be an arbitrator, who would be neutral for the that would not have a stake in this for the UK government. So I can't see how these proposals can go ahead, because I know that Mike Russell has made clear that the Scottish government will not conform to what these proposals are. And I think, although the Welsh government hasn't been as vocal about this, I suspect that they'll come to the same conclusion. But I mean, I'm saying this as an observer. I'm not in the Welsh government, but that would be my impression. Certainly, I think that they seem more and more exasperated with it.
Now, Today, Mark Drakeford is quoted in the news as saying that the UK government shouldn't stand in the way of any independence vote in the future. Is that a surprise to you? Or is this just something that it's kind of safe for him to say while support for independence is still at a relatively low level?
I don't think that support for independence is at a low level in Wales. We've had a poll that has come out this week that says actually a majority, if you take out the don't knows, and a majority of voters for the Labour Party in Wales actually would back independence. So that's probably what Mark Drakeford was responding to in those comments. But I do find what he said surprising, although obviously I agree with him entirely in what he said. It does seem to undermine his actions in July, because at the end of our last Senedd term, Plaid Cymru hosted a debate in the Senedd, which was proposing that Wales should have the right to decide whether we should have an independence referendum in the future. It wasn't about whether Wales should be independent. It was simply making the constitutional point that it should be for the Senedd to decide that. And the Welsh Labour government voted against that motion. In fact, they deleted the entire motion and replaced it with something which had nothing to do with the matter. So I'm afraid that this is a pattern that we see with Labour in Wales, that they will say one thing and act in another way. I mean, Mark Drakeford last year had said to me, actually, in a committee meeting, I had asked him whether his support for the union was unconditional. And I'd asked that if Scotland did become independent, as I believe firmly that you will, if Scotland becomes independent, then would he still support the idea of a union without Scotland? And he told me that his support was not unconditional, and that there would be some issues that would have to make him reassess. Obviously, that was a completely valid and reasonable response. It did make some headlines, and he was his office, I think, were quite quick to try and retract what he said. But once he has admitted that that is the case and that the union cannot be unconditionally supported, I was dismayed that he and his government had voted against our motion in July. And I believe I'm right in saying that every single Labour backbencher also voted. No, I'm sure that they all did vote against this as well. So I think that it makes sense for the Labour Party in Wales to be more open to the idea of independence, because I mean the past few months have shown us, as we've been talking about, they've shown how little regard Westminster has for the devolved administrations. That isn't going to change. And in fact, as we've just been talking about in terms of what's happening with Brexit, I think it's going to get worse. I think they're going to try and dismantle and undermine devolution. So we can't just stand still where we are. And I think that that's the danger and the tension that we've got in politics in Wales, because the Labour Party have been in power for 20 years. The Labour Party has been in government, sometimes in coalition, yes, but they have always been in government for the entirety of the history of the Senedd, of the institution. The same party has been in power. I don't think that's healthy for any democracy. Now, obviously, I can't blame the Labour Party for this. Of course, they'd want to be in power. But I don't think it's healthy for the Labour Party, because it means that they are constantly having to defend how things are, because it's in their interests to want to retain power. So there's this tension. I know that they are members. I mean, there's a group called Labour for Indie Wales. That they are definitely lay members of the Labour Party who support the idea of independence. What I'd say to them and to any people who are either members of Labour or who have voted for Labour in the past is, unfortunately, the Labour Party is not willing to listen to them at the moment. And so Plaid Cymru is the only party with any hope of being in government that will actually drive through to have an independence referendum, and that who would want to see that change for the people of Wales. So I would urge them to join and to support Plaid Cymru. But it's interesting how these things how politicians sometimes, just frustratingly, will say one thing, even though their actions completely contradict what they're saying. It's, again, our absence of a very strong Welsh media, with some very notable exceptions, that means that people can get away with that more, and that's a bit frustrating. So I'm very glad that you've picked up on it.
Now, you did mention there the question of what Scottish independence might do to the situation in Wales. What do you think would happen? I mean, we're now looking at a draft independence bill around March next year, and we're being told a referendum later in the year. If Scotland were to vote to leave the Union, what impact do you think that would have in Wales? What difference would it make to the independence movement specifically?
I think it would change it fundamentally. I mean, we already have an independence movement that in the past couple of years, even, or year and a half, has really grown to be something really exciting and vibrant and positive. And we've had these all under one banner marches, as you've had in Scotland. Obviously, those haven't been possible during the lockdown and with the COVID restrictions. So, I mean, I think and looking at how support for independence has risen in opinion polls recently, and even when I talk to my neighbours on the street, this is just something that is far more. It is no longer considered to be a fringe issue by any means. So I think we're starting from a very different base than we would have been a couple of years ago. But I think if Scotland were to become independent, and I really do believe that it's going to happen, so when Scotland becomes independent, I think that that's going to change everything completely, because you can make a case which I don't believe holds water, but you can obviously make a case for the Union as it stands now because it exists right now. I think that it is crumbling in front of our eyes, but it does exist. I don't think there's anywhere in the world where a union exists where one partner out of two, because I think we're also going to see a united Ireland, one partner out of the two so fundamentally dwarfs the other in terms of numbers and in terms of where the share of power is centred. So I think, a number of prominent Labour politicians, including the former First Minister, Carwyn Jones, have said that actually a union of Wales and England does not make sense. So what I think is that because of that, and because Scottish independence is going to happen, I think it really is going to happen, we could be facing a situation where Wales almost would face independence as a default. Now, we don't want that to happen, because then obviously terms that would be negotiated could not be to the benefit of Wales in the same way as if we'd been planning for it for a long time. So it makes just reasonable and economic sense to be planning for that to happen now, rather than waiting for our fate to be determined by what happens elsewhere. That has been the fate of Wales for far too long, that we are far too often an afterthought. And I'm very excited by what's happening in Scotland. I'm looking on with delight and joy when I see the new polls and everything that are coming out. But I don't want us to just have independence because it's almost forced upon us. I want us to have independence because that is the only path that provides hope and prosperity for Wales, and change that is so desperately needed.
Now, we have seen support for independence in Scotland and in Wales rising, particularly during the pandemic. What do you think is driving that? Is Boris Johnson the worst thing ever to happen to the Union?
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? Because when he became Prime Minister, he made himself Minister for the Union as well.
Yeah.
I bet that he regretted that. Yeah, I think that Boris Johnson is the opposite of a poster boy for the Union, whatever that would be. I think that the pandemic it's forced people to recognise so many truths that we all probably were aware of, but they hadn't been at the forefront of debate in the same way before. in the and as I was saying earlier about people's awareness in Wales of devolution having been strengthened a lot during the pandemic, I think that people then have become grateful for the fact that decisions affecting people's lives and their safety and public health could be made as close to the people as was possible. I think that people were grateful that that happened, and I think that at the same, so you've got the kind of the positive, the gratitude, and those positive reasons why people are glad of the ability for things to be different. At the same time, we see that the UK government, I don't want to say uniquely because I've already made claims like this earlier in the program, but certainly they are amongst, and I compared maybe with every except for the US, they are amongst the worst in terms of how we have performed on a UK level, in terms of trying to combat COVID-19, in terms of how we've failed to look out for the most vulnerable in too many situations. Now, I think that people have been very quick to see the flaws in how the this UK government operates. You know, the stuff about Dominic Cummings and driving to Barnard Castle and all that. I mean, it's become a bit of a farce. And you also add in then the fact that there seems to be such little respect shown to what is different. You know, Boris Johnson talking with frustration about the fact that Wales and Scotland have decided to not follow the same quarantine regulations, as though England should just set the standard and we should always comply. I mean, people are more and more, I think, seeing through Boris Johnson, and I think as a result of that, people are seeing that actually this system shouldn't be allowed to undermine us so much in the first place. I wonder whether, I mean, we can't know, but I wonder how things would have been and how they would have played out if we'd had a different Prime Minister of the UK during this time who was not quite so gung-ho about dismantling people's trust, essentially. I wonder how that would have played out. But as it stands, I think that Boris Johnson has maybe helped us in our case, because his popularity, certainly amongst people who I know and people who I talk to and people who maybe are not of the same political persuasion as me, people who don't follow politics quite as much, but people who just, you know, my friends on Facebook, things like that, I think that people have really seen through him. And he represents Westminster, doesn't he? He is the face of Westminster. And it's not a very pretty sight at the moment.
Well, just finally then, Delyth, before we have to let you go, you mentioned there is, of course, an election next year. Now, obviously, Plaid will be wanting to talk about independence, but just quickly, what are the other kind of big ticket issues that you think are going to be on the agenda at the election next year?
So obviously, COVID-19 has made, like I said, it's made us reassess so many things about how society operates and what needs to change. One of the main things that has characterized the past few months is that people have really come to appreciate the work that care workers do. And I am fairly confident that one of the main pledges that Plaid Cymru will be going into the election with is that we want to see a unified national health and care service. That we shouldn't just be applauding care workers on the street, as was happening during the lockdown. We should be paying them in the same way. We should give them parity of pay conditions as people working in the health service. Now, and we also want to see fundamental reforms and making sure that the care sector is not kind of marginalized in the way that it has been too much in this period. So as part of my role, I'm the spokesperson on housing. I think that housing is another issue that has really been highlighted in terms of its importance the past few months. That a house is so much more than four walls and a roof, that it should be a place that provides solace and comfort and security. But for lots of people, too many people, it hasn't been a place of security and solace because they are renting properties. And although landlords have been stopped temporarily from evicting them into homelessness, in Wales, it is still legal to evict someone into homelessness. It hasn't been banned. So we will definitely be campaigning to make sure that we don't just ban evictions into homelessness, and we don't just temporarily make sure that people who were living on the streets are accommodated, that we provide sustainable housing that offers security and comfort to people, that homes should be about sustaining and supporting communities. It should be about supporting people. They shouldn't just be a commodity. Because in lots of our rural areas, this is probably true in some of the islands in Scotland and probably coastal areas too, we have a real issue with second home ownership. Now, I don't begrudge anyone having a second home, but I do begrudge the idea of people who already own a property buying a second property in an area and inflating the house prices so much that people who want to live near their families are unable to buy anyway. So I think we need to have a fundamental conversation and action taken to reassess how we in society think about homes. I think that housing should be a human right, and I will certainly be pushing for that to be one of Plaid Cymru's main pledges for the election. I mean, I think that is something that the last few months have shown. If you didn't have a home, then you were far more exposed to catching the virus. If you didn't have a home where you felt secure, then the lockdown would have been an even more difficult period than it would have been for everyone else. So I think that there are things that these would have been important to us anyway, but our experiences collectively of the past few months have just shown that those are things that we need to change as a society. And we've got this window of opportunity to change things, to be radical. Think how awful it will be if that opportunity passes us by. If we just roll back to how things were before, that can't be allowed to happen.
Yeah. Well, Delyth Jewell, Plaid Cymru Shadow Minister for Transforming Public Services and the Future, which I have to say is just about the coolest title in politics. Delyth, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
Absolutely. Pleasure to speak to you.
So that was my interview with Delyth Jewell earlier this afternoon, and we do thank Delyth very much for sparing the time to talk to us, and we very much do hope that she will be back soon. So that is all we have time for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have an audience for these shows. We would ask, if you're able to, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up there as a supporter. We do need every penny we can get just to keep Broadcasting Scotland on the air. So if you're able to support us financially, then please do. If you're not able to support us financially, we do understand. Please remember the shows are always free to view online. But you can make a big difference by reaching out to other people on our behalf. Word of mouth is the main way that we are able to spread the word about Broadcasting Scotland. And even if you're not able to contribute, you can perhaps encourage a new viewer to contribute. If you do follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, find us on Facebook as well. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, click the bell icon there, like the videos, and then share them around with your friends and family and anyone else you think might be interested in what we do here at Broadcasting Scotland. And finally, we've talked about this a lot recently, but we are always in need of new people to help out here at Broadcasting Scotland. Building a broadcaster takes a lot of work by a lot of people, and we do need your help with that. So if you've got any interest in getting involved here, please get in touch with us as well. We would love to hear from you. But that is all we have time for this evening. So thank you once again to Delyth Jewell for joining us. I'll be back on Sunday with the full Scottish, but until then, have a great weekend. Good night. Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And tonight we have an interview I recorded a wee bit earlier today with Delyth Jewell, a member of the Welsh Senate for Plaid Cymru. But before we get to that, we have all the news headlines for you. We start